Welcome to another episode of Sync Riffs. My name is Charles from Blue Buddha, and joined by Chase Walker. How's it going, Chase?
Hey, it's going good. How are you doing, Charles?
Doing good, doing good. Another episode, and looking forward to unpacking. Today, we got a lot of questions and feedback from everybody out there on cover tunes and samples when it comes to the sync space. So some really important concepts there to unpack. And we'll take from the top with cover tunes. So a lot of people throw the term around. So to be really technical, reading from the definition in popular music, a cover version song is a remake, revival, or simply cover is a new performance or recording by a musician other than the original performer or composer of the song. So when it comes to sync, as far as clearance goes, if you cover Bad to the Bone by George Thorogood, you as the indie artist, you created a new composition that you control the master rights to. So Blue Buddha would pitch that cover version, and we would tag it as master representation. And George Thorogood, Bad to the Bone, writing and the publishing, whoever owns the rights to that, the studio production would go to the publisher, the copyright holder, and clear the other side of that. So the benefits of doing cover tunes, as we've seen in recent years, in whether it's trailers or films, is putting your own stamp on a cover tune, flipping it, making it completely different in the sense that there's still a sense of je ne sais quoi. There's people can, I know this track, but I use an example from Donnie Darko. It was Tears for Fears Mad World, and covering that tune gives a different life to the song. And especially with trailers years back, you know, in catching and grabbing the familiarity of a cover tune in the audience, it really resonates. So that's how, because it came up, we were working with a label partner, and it's important that when we get assets, the songs from our artists or our labels, sometimes there could be obscure covers, so it's really, really important, and we stress this, is when we work with an indie artist, folks can cover a tune, and you can't assume we're going to know it's a cover, especially if it's obscure. So the danger is if we get a track, and this is where due diligence, we have to vet your songs. If it's a cover tune, we, as the pitching agent, we have to mark it clearly that it's a cover, it's master representation, because if it goes out as one-stop rep, it's going to blow things up. Clearance issue, if there's a major publisher involved. So especially it's really important if it's an obscure cover, and I stress that of the indie artist, having your ducks in a row when you submit your tracks, and all the writer pub info is there, and if it's a cover, clearly marking that. You have any cover tunes in your catalog, Chase?
Yeah, on the first couple albums that I put out with my band back when I was in high school, we did quite a few cover songs on there. One thing I think that probably a lot of people might get confused when it comes to covers, because for most independent artists out there, if they've ever covered a song before, they understand the concept of acquiring what's called a mechanical license. And that's essentially a license to fix someone else's song in a mechanical form. And so when that term was sort of coined for that meaning, that was back when music was reproduced via mechanical means, not necessarily digital means. So like think of mechanical license, that's basically meaning like fixing a song, someone else's song, to a vinyl record so that it can mechanically be heard. So the difference when it comes to a mechanical license versus clearing something for sync is that when it comes to the copyright and the intellectual property, whether that's for the composition or for the master, a mechanical, the right to fix in mechanical form is one of the many rights that you get as a copyright holder. The right to license, to license your work for synchronization to a visual medium is a completely different right than the mechanical right. So if you're familiar with receiving or obtaining mechanical licenses for doing covers, that has nothing really to do with sync. In the realm of sync, basically what you're presenting, what you're representing to the supervisor or even to your agent is the fact that you are controlling the recording of this song. A song that was written by somebody else that you don't own, but you do own that recording. From there, what has to happen is the supervisors then clear it. Now, the interesting connection between creating songs that are covers and creating songs that use samples in the master recording is that in both cases, what you are essentially doing most of the time is creating what's called a derivative work. Basically what that means is that you're taking someone else's copyright, whether that's the composition that you are covering for your own new master recording, or whether that's someone else's recording that you're then taking and putting into your own recording. You are taking someone else's copyright and transforming it in some way to create your own original work, right? And so the technical term for that is a derivative work. In the realm of cover songs, you essentially have to clear the rights for that composition in the same way that if you use a sample in your recording from someone else's recording, the supervisor will have to go and clear that sample from whoever owns that sample in very similar manner.
Yeah, and we'll segue into the second portion into that realm. But yeah, that's a good setup for that, and a good summation of that, Chase. And thanks for that. Is also, for sync purposes, we get the question, what songs should I cover? Well, 80s, 90s, if you do your homework and you see what's currently being used, I think Yellow Jackets, it was might have been a David Bowie track, and you can kind of see what's being licensed in that space or realm, if you will, that lane for covers. Because there's certain artists that for sync, I think it was Neil Young, still to this day. If you cover a Neil Young track, his publisher they're not going to approve the sync because it goes back to the artist. And
at one time too, there was sort of a culture with artists where like they didn't want to license anything because that was seen as like selling out. Like even now, like it's only been very recently that anyone's been able to license anything from Led Zeppelin, right?
Yeah. No, and that's, I'll have to dig up the article, but I think there was Zuckerberg, Facebook was trying to license track. I can't remember who it was from. And he was like, no, I'm not going to help you sell more money for Facebook or, for your empire by me granting this license to the song, no matter how much money he was going to offer him. So yeah, that's bang on. So, typically, and also as a sync agent, our relationships with major publishers, knowing, what will clear when it comes to certain covers. So I think, the sort of reverse engineering, if you look at current productions and what's being, what covers are being uh, cleared for various productions. And then to thread the needle with samples, to get technical into it, Chase, you had set it up, but by definition, um, if what is a sample? You know, Chase, do you want to sum up again? You had a
Yeah.
good summation of what a sample is.
So basically, you're in the same way that with a cover song, you're taking someone else's composition, reworking it, and making it your own sort of thing. Sample, you're taking someone else's recording and you're either pitching it up or slowing it down or whatever it is you're doing. Maybe you're not even doing anything to it. You're just looping it and throwing other stuff on top of it. Basically, you're taking someone else's recording and using it in your own way for your own recording in some form or fashion, and you're changing it. Typically, you're changing it in some way. You're not just taking someone else's recording and then just re-releasing it as like, hey, here's my song. It's called Imagine by
Right.
It sounds a lot like John Lennon, but don't worry about that.
Yeah, no, right. That's a dead ringer. Yeah, and as you were saying that, I pulled up. Um, so the full definition in sound and music sampling is the reuse of a portion or sample of a sound recording in another recording. Samples may comprise elements such as rhythm, melody, speech, sound effects, or longer portions of music, and may be layered, EQ'd, sped up or slowed down, repitched, looped, or otherwise manipulated. They're usually integrated using electronic music instruments, a sampler, or software such as digital audio workstations. But I think a key thing there to underscore is rhythm, melody, speech, sound effects. I've had cases where I asked an artist, did you use any samples? I said, they're like, yeah, I did, but I pitch shifted it down. You can't really tell. But the good through line there to share is, there's software out there that the productions, it'll flag if it's a sample. They can discern that. So sort of, full transparency when we work with an indie artist is, if there are samples, copyright is copyright. If we were to pitch your song and then that question comes up, like, oh, I only used half a second of 1 second of it, not 5 minutes of it, that's still copyright infringement. And if that sample, it would need to be cleared, what Chase was alluding to earlier. If it's a notable sample, even if it's unrecognizable, it's not your intellectual property. So the super would have to clear that. So in that case, songs that have samples, we can't pitch that for sync. So, I've had someone said, well, it was an obscure piece of vinyl from back in the 60s. No one's going to know. But so that's the
You'd be surprised. People find out, man. It's crazy.
yeah, no. It's and I've had that where artists where I think it was a sample from The Matrix, and it was that scene when the dialogue when he's talking about the blue pill or the red pill.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and Neo was talking, or Lawrence Fishburne's character,
Right.
Morpheus,
Yeah.
and the person had pitch shifted the vocal way down, but it was so discernible. And
Yeah. How much do you think the studio is going to want for the use of that, man?
oh man, right? Yeah, that's
Yeah.
That's going to blow up the budget for sure. So yeah, so that's, you know, due diligence where it's, I think what's important also to thread the needle is, and Steve, I think you agree on this, Chase, is if you're a songwriter, really asking those questions to your producer and knowing, because sometimes, correct, Chase, is say you're the vocalist, you go in, you lay the vocal tracks down, and then you go home, and then the producer works their magic. You may not know, oh, they threw in some samples.
Right. Well, and yeah, and there's a lot of artists that work that way. I am a maniac, so I had to figure out how to record my own stuff on my own. But there's a lot of people that they don't have time to figure out how to connect a dozen different pieces of hardware together and all that. So it's definitely a reasonable thing to go and work with a producer. Mm-hmm. Here's where it gets a little bit sticky, so to speak, is that a lot of producers, they'll have a library of pre-made samples, and the reason is because by using those pre-made sounds, it makes the process of building out a track super quick, right? Mm-hmm. One guy that I like, I really love to watch do his work is this guy named Kenny Beats, and he releases a whole bunch of videos on YouTube and all. And like every artist he works with is like, how do you already have this track made? Well, it's because he's got a lot of this stuff is pre-built, and so he's just kind of throwing it in, layering it on top. Where it gets tricky is because a lot of sample pack providers will provide these bundles of sounds where they allow whoever's using them to use them for commercial use on commercial projects, but they don't specify that you're able to use them for sync licensing. So in many cases, even if you've purchased a royalty-free sample pack, it's royalty-free for the purposes of releasing it on Spotify or printing albums or CDs or general sales to audiences. But when it comes to licensing those sounds for a new purpose, which would be synchronization to film and TV, a lot of times the companies that provide these sample packs, they reserve that right to approve or to collect on those licenses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's, I think, what we'll do in a future podcast episode when we have a music super in the room, in the studio, so to speak, is we'll pose that question to them. But to, underscore your point, Chase, is the TOS, the terms of service, reading that fine print and really understanding legally what you're bound to, what your rights are. And I think, Chase, we've seen cases where if language doesn't, if it's left to interpretation, it's gray, then that's a slippery slope. Because in a court of law, if they don't explicitly say, because why would they not mention sync when they know it's a potential money earner? And to bookend, preparing for this podcast on that subject matter, it's an interesting point, Chase, is where, like you said, if you and I are two separate artists, we use the same loop from a sample pack. And then the music super gets songs from each of us in a given lane, say it's hip hop or electronic, what have you. Then it's a red flag. It's confusion. They're like, hey, I heard that Chase on DJ C's track, and then W.C. Walker had that same beat. What, who owns it? So that in itself creates, a red flag or doubt of who's the right holder.
100%. And like, here's the thing, like, say you're a really great producer who knows also how to play a host of instruments, and so you can record your own samples, right? if as much as you can make that not sound as though it was sampled, you're going to have a higher likelihood of getting those placements, because you're not freaking the supervisors out with making them think that, oh shoot, there's like, this sounds so much like a sample, so I'm going to have all this work to do. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, and I think there was a producer, to your point, that they gave an example of, is if they would Shazam a given hook or a loop, and then they would find 5 other songs out there in the ethos that had that same loop, that same beat. And if it was predominantly in the chorus or the main hook, or like you said, commercial release, and imagine if someone's trying to clear that for sync, it opens up a can of worms. But safe to say, obviously, in your lane, indie blues rock, all original, you're not really relying on sample packs.
100%. Another thing I wanted to add too, because a lot of artists, when it comes to cover material, they're used to this. They may be familiar with or used to this idea of a compulsory mechanical license, which is where you can go to a company, used to be before, companies like Harry Fox, but now a lot of that's handled through the MLC, the Mechanical Licensing Collective. Basically, what that is if a song's been released and you're doing a direct cover, which is not transformed in any way, it's like you're basically just covering the song yourself the exact same way it was originally released. You can submit for what's called a compulsory license, which is essentially you're paying the artist for a certain number of copies of the song, and they have to say yes, because under statute, it's one of the ways that the statute balances the rights of the copyright holders and the rights of the copyright users, right? So where that changes for samples is that there is no such thing as a compulsory license for samples in the first place. In sync in general, there is no one's relying on any sort of compulsory consent to use anything. So everything has to be cleared. That's first off. And you want to make sure that whatever is getting cleared is affordable for the supervisor. So if you use a sample from some record that's was put out by Warner or Sony or Universal, that's gonna completely blow your chances of getting that placement, unless you carry the kind of weight that record you sampled carries. Maybe if you're Beyonce and you want to sample something from Prince, well, Beyonce and Prince might have a very similar budget range, so it's not necessarily as big of a deal. But you want to make sure that you're not blowing your own chances there.
No, and also, I mean, the biggest point is supers don't like surprises there, and if it ruins your chances to be able to work with them in the future, because it just shows if you're not 100% and you have all the boxes checked off, and it's just 101 of navigating original songs without any surprises there on the clearance and impacting. No one wants to step into that landmine, so to speak.
The simpler the better, basically.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Spot on. And similarly, I think to put things in context, when we get songs from an indie artist, sometimes artists will record their own voice, maybe run it through echo or reverb, and then I'll be like, is that a sample? Like, whose voice is that? So I'll ask the lead singer, and oh, that's my voice. So I think, that's something, if one's doing something like that and it's creative enough, just flag it so we know, oh, and by the way, that's my voice. Because then it's an extra step that we have to go back and ask the artist and make sure. Because, my ear's in tune where I'm like, wait a minute, that sounds too cool. What is that? Would you agree there, Chase? I'm sure there are other examples you might have come across worth, yeah.
Definitely. And like I was getting to before, if you're able to create your own samples, you might want a sound that sounds like you're using samples, but you don't want to have to pay royalties on those samples, or you just don't want to have to pay for one of those royalty-free sample packs, which is not necessarily entirely royalty-free in the first place. But let's say you're going for that sampled kind of sound, which is its own sound to begin with. You definitely want to put some specifying information in there that lets people know that there's not going to be any issues with any of the recordings used for that track.
Yeah, no, have you ever, in any of your works, do you ever go that route? Or I mean, I imagine then, it could be a time suck depending.
Yeah, well, I've used, I guess you could call it a sample library of sorts, but it was basically a library of like stomps and claps, which for the most part, those kind of fall into the same category as most like plugins fall into. Like if you have a Superior Drummer is a really good example of like it's a MIDI drum software that uses real recordings of drums, but in the capacity of a MIDI instrument, right? And so for those sorts of things, oftentimes it's fully there's no caveats on the back end because they're making it specifically for people to reuse and recreate in multiple different ways.
Okay, cool. No, that's good to underscore there, because I think similarly we get the question is, I think there was a case where someone's like, I sampled it was a news piece from a Russian channel, BBC UK. Can I use that in a song? So what would the analysis be there for a news broadcast? Say it was Walter Cronkite, CBS News.
Right. Well, there are. Yeah, it's kind of a lot of this falls into a gray area, as well. But there are some cases to be made for being able to use stuff like that for fair use. But in a commercial sense, those audio recordings are still property of CBS. You know what I mean? They're still going to be the property of whoever released those in the first place, unless they're over a certain age and have fallen into the public domain, which I've done that before. I've actually looked up like old films that, I just wanted some voice saying something in a certain part, you know what I mean? So I looked up old films that were in the public domain and was able to use those without any issue.
So yeah, do you want to touch on real quick what's the statute with respect to PD, public domain?
Well, that is a very tricky subject in and of itself. There's a lot of videos out there. So many people may already be familiar with the idea that the reason why the public domain statute extends for so long and why we have such old material right now that's not in the public domain yet is primarily because of Disney trying to hold on to the copyright of Mickey Mouse and all of their primary, revenue earners. But what it essentially comes down to is life of the author of the work plus 70 years. Now that may change depending on if that work was, if the ownership of that work was transferred to another entity at any point. But that's the general guideline that most people understand public domain by. So at this point, most things that are in the public domain, you're talking at the latest the 20s or 30s. There are some old films from like the 50s that have fallen into the public domain, mostly because they were either like PSAs that were meant for the public domain in the first place, or just, the copyright holders can also, I forget what the technical term is, but you can basically like volunteer your work for the public domain where you're not, you're just not exploiting it anymore. But yeah, it's essentially life of the author plus 70 years.
Yeah, no, and thanks for recapping that. Well done and correct. There are databases, or you can look up what falls into the PD.
Yes, yeah, you can look up. Yeah, very very similar to like the Mechanical Licensing Collective. Not necessarily all of them are entirely comprehensive, so you need to double check, especially if you're using something that might be on the verge of being public domain or not. You need to double check that no one has it. If it is registered in some public domain registry, go and double check that no one also has it registered under the Mechanical Licensing Collective or any other agencies like that for whatever piece of work it is.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So, every year when it comes to pitching Christmas tracks, supers in a brief will say, I need a PD public domain of a Christmas tune. So then once you ascertain what those songs are, then you cover, do your version of that PD Christmas, and then full due diligence. If we get a track from an artist who says, oh, this is PD, well, we're going to go and look and fully verify that, because I've had cases where someone sent me something and they said it was PD and it wasn't. Due diligence, making sure does it fall within that definition of public domain, or is it still does someone still have the rights to that on the publishing and the writer share? So yeah, that's post those comments, because we touched on the surface of the two topics there: cover versions and samples, and a little bit about PD. But at the end of the day, as an independent artist, when you're looking to work with a sync agent or pitch your songs to a super, really making sure you have all the information and you understand and be able to articulate to an agent, the rights to your songs when you're in the studio working with a producer. It's a good conversation to have ahead of time with the producer, making sure, because if they're going to be recording your song, you got to make sure they're not relying on samples, because producers, they could be genius wizards in creating a given track, but the realm of sync is a whole different knowledge base. And if a producer's never synced up a song or worked with an agent or worked with a super, we don't expect them to have that information or understand it comprehensively, unless they did it before. They took a course, UCLA Extension or USC, on sampling, publishing, clearing a track for synchronization. So these are good conversations to protect you as an artist when you're creating songs with a producer or with a team. And just making sure everything's sorted out for clearance. Otherwise, supers are going to be less likely to work with you in the future if there was an issue. So with that, post those comments. We're happy to, in other episodes, cover off questions that you have. Smash that like button, subscribe, and we'll catch you on this other side. Thank you so much for tuning in. Namaste.
Go.